the Sackler Colloquia on the science of science communication, where scientists and communication professionals come together to write a better future for communicating science.
Okay, let me welcome you back to our final session of the day. It will be my pleasure to introduce the speaker, my wonderful co-organizer of this session, of this colloquium and the previous one, Dietram Scheufele from the University of Wisconsin, and his two discussants will be Kathleen Jamieson from the University of Pennsylvania and Patrick Sturgis from the University of Southampton in reverse order. So let me welcome Dietram.
We're shifting gears a little bit, but actually after the last session, in many ways the last session was a really good transitional session to the topic of this one, which is the science communication as political communication. And I want to touch on four different areas in the 24 minutes that I have. When the question of what happens when science meets politics, and science meeting politics more and more, and in many ways I think this is a trend that's not going to change anytime soon. The second area that I want to touch on is what we know from social science, especially about mediated environments. What ends up happening when media and science meet, and what are the processes in which science gets translated through various types of both traditional and new media. The third area is why is all of that getting more and more complicated for the audiences that have to deal with that science, those media environments, and why are some of the more ideological processes that surround that getting more and more complicated. And then I just want to end on one or two final steps on what I think research agendas need to look like, and things that we both as researchers and maybe as practitioners need to start thinking about. But let me start with the idea that science meets politics, and in many ways the picture here of Galileo Galilei is a good example, because he was certainly not the first one, but one of the earlier examples of science and politics interfacing. And if we like it or not, that's not going to get any better or different depending on what your viewpoint is anytime soon. Most scientific issues that we're dealing with, most modern scientific issues, are inherently political issues. If that's stem cell research, and we've seen multiple campaigns that were run, both gubernatorial and national ones, with stem cell research being an important element. If that's climate change, I think there's not much more we have to say. But there are also issues like obesity that we'll deal with in day 3 that have been inherently politicized in their applications and in the political choices and interpretation of data. And of course, one of the last ones, synthetic biology. And I just want to stick with synthetic biology for a second, because it's actually a really good example of an issue that we keep getting surprised about how low levels of awareness are. So about a year and a half ago, we did a national survey at the University of Wisconsin where we asked people standard questions about nano, about nuclear, about synthetic biology, including how much people have heard or seen. So your standard question of awareness. And synthetic biology, of course, is just the new nano. It's now where nano used to be. People are a little bit more aware of nano now than they used to be, and it's going to go up, but it's never going to reach levels where we're going to be satisfied, that people know enough or understand it enough. And SynBio is just taking that bottom slot now. The funny thing, of course, is, or maybe depressing thing, is that policy stances around synthetic biology are equally fuzzy, to say the very least. In that same survey, we asked people if they thought that it was true or false that the Obama administration had recently banned all research on synthetic biology. About a third of Americans actually know that that's false. So one in 3 actually knows that that's not the case. The other ones are fuzzy on it. While 12% technically are not fuzzy, they think that it's actually true. And about half, 55%, just don't know. So this is exactly the typical scientific issue that we're dealing with, where both the scientific knowledge and the policy knowledge surrounding it is and will remain fairly fuzzy. So what does that mean as far as some of the big questions that we need to ask ourselves, especially when it comes to how some of that science either gets politicized or plays out in political environments? And one of the things that I want to talk about, just as I think an important model to keep in mind, is the idea that this is our ideal picture of how the world works. The ideal picture is that There are things happening in politics, there are things happening in society, in economics, whatever else, and audiences pay attention, and it gets mirrored. Audiences know exactly what's happening in politics, they know what's happening in the economy, and what's happening in science. The problem, of course, is that none of us can observe these things directly. Few of us, and when I say us, I mean various members of various groups of lay publics, never observe a scientist in a lab. They've never seen Obama talk to his advisors. They've never seen most members of Congress. Yet they have a fairly good image of what they think is happening and if Obama is a good person, if he's warm or not, and whatever else. Why is that? Well, because our realities are not directly observed realities. Most and the vast, vast, vast majority of our realities are mediated realities, constructed realities. Not in a value-laden way constructed, but constructed nonetheless. And that construction is an important element of how all of us, lay audiences in particular, think about science. And the first one of first construction is what media talk about in the first place. The idea that what we talk about on a daily basis is not a given. It's selected. And it's selected in a process that we've researched for decades called agenda building. So the idea that what ends up in a newscast, in a newspaper, or even on a website, on a blog, or whatever else, ends up being negotiated between the people who write that content, who select that content, corporations who try to push certain content, scientists who write press releases, try to build relationships with journalists to get their stories covered, and so on and so forth. So it's a fairly elaborate process. And in that process, and this is another thing when we talk about science communication, science is only one voice of many, many, many voices in society. And to just look at some research that was done by Matt Nisbet and Dominique Broussard and Adrienne Krupsch, and both Dominique and Matt were speakers at the first iteration of the Sackler Colloquium on the Science of Science Communication. They looked at coverage on stem cell research, for instance. Up to 2001 is when their study was published. The interesting thing about this graph, number one, is if you look at anything that happened before the early 90s, you have actually a fair amount of scientific productivity. Very little of which made it into press coverage, which is that thin black line. There are also very few press releases, and the amount of coverage that hockey stick, to use some climate change language here, just it starts to increase when you actually see activities around press releases and around Capitol Hill testimony. So in other words, once politics gets involved and once corporations and other organizations that issue press releases routinely get involved, you see coverage increase. And it spikes, of course, in the controversy stage when you have the most coverage, loads of press releases, and also congressional activity. So again, the lesson, science being only one voice and really very often being out-communicated in terms of what makes it onto the agenda and when it does make it onto the agenda. The second question, in addition to what media talk about is, well, actually, let me stick with that for just 1 second here because there's a second outcome of that. Once things are on the media agenda, we actually only care about that in many ways because that influences the issue priorities that we have as a public. Why at this given moment do we not care about the thousands of children that die every day in Africa from waterborne illnesses? Why do we care about what Miley Cyrus did at the VMAs? And the answer is because our agendas, our issue priorities are set on a fairly, I hope we don't care about Miley Cyrus anymore, by the way, it's a different issue, but are essentially set by what media tell us is important, either by covering it a lot, and we know this from, again, decades of agenda setting research, or by prominently covering it. And there's a second step coming out of that, which is often referred to as media priming, so that what I think is salient, what is salient and easily retrievable from memory for me as an audience member, ends up shaping evaluations of candidates, of issues, and whatever else. Why? Because if something is easily retrievable from memory, if that's made salient, what is also made salient is a whole bunch of related nodes that connect to that issue, if that's climate change, for instance, or anything else. Bill Clinton in 1992, running on the economy. George Bush, 41 at the time, not knowing what a supermarket scanner is. The moment the issue becomes salient in people's consideration, they start essentially evaluations of George Bush go down because he is connected, because his lack of knowledge about a supermarket scanner is directly connected to now the more salient issue of the economy. So that also is an important point when it comes to issues like climate change, where we routinely expect our candidates to talk about climate change. We bemoan this both domestically but also internationally, that we don't have enough coverage. But there's no good reason for any campaign advisor to tell either Romney or Obama to put this on the issue, because it's a lose-lose issue for either one of them. If I'm Obama and I haven't done very well on cap and trade, the last thing I want to do is make an issue salient and push it onto the agenda that ultimately will hurt my evaluations with my base. And if I'm Mitt Romney and I have to compete in a primary, it's exactly the same thing because, of course, climate change is not a seller in my constituency in the first place. So the idea that we turn to politicians to push science on the agenda is in certain ways a naive one, and for many scientific issues it makes absolutely no sense for candidates to do that. As I said, in addition to what we talk about, and lots of research on this topic, there's also, of course, a lot of research on how we talk about science. And we've heard about, we'll hear more about narratives. We heard some talk about narratives this morning, touching on some of the same ideas. And some of you have heard me talk about this before, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I just for the sake of completion, wanted to mention, of course, the idea of framing. Right? The idea that there is no such thing as information, especially if it's ambiguous. And science is your perfect ambiguous stimulus. The idea that multi-walled carbon nanotubes may cause cancer because they behave similar to asbestos fibers. But multi-walled carbon nanotubes, of course, are also important components of many types of materials and machinery and equipment that may allow for early detection of cancer. So which one is it? For a lay audience who has no training in nanotechnology or in any of the disciplines that go into it, this is an ambiguous stimulus. I could interpret this one way or the other. Tony the Frankentiger, genetically frosted fakes, of course, being the perfect example, saying, I can explain this stimulus to you, I can frame it to you in two different ways to allow you to put something that you ultimately don't understand on one shelf or another. And that's, in this case, maybe has well, not maybe, certainly has a partisan motivation, but in most cases, it's actually a simple tool for information processing. Meaning, using certain terminology, certain modes of presentation is crucially important, and we know this from hundreds of studies, to help us determine why an issue is important. And just think about, for those of you academics, how you teach undergraduate courses, and how you explain certain topics to them, and how you frame it and present it to them, and also to process information that I have no idea how to process. Which cognitive shelf do I put this information on? Well, frames give me an immediate shortcut to allow me to do that, or help me to do that. That also means that messages, and just to reiterate what we heard this morning, that also means that a message will be most successful if the way it is being presented, how it's framed, ends up resonating with underlying schema, ends up resonating with a shelf system, if you will, just to put it somewhat simplistically, that I already have, and it will be less successful, it will have less of an effect if it doesn't. The final note is, the most important part is there is no such thing as an unframed message. If I want to publish a study in Science, I will have to convince the editors that it's transformative. I will have to convince them that it has broad appeal across disciplines. And unless I frame it that way, it is not going to get published in Science. So even in our professional language, framing is actually something that we could routinely use, grant proposals to the NSF, not any different. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. The third area, and this is something that Katie touched a little bit on earlier, is the importance of public opinion and the importance of media telling us what our social environments look like. Because again, I have no way of telling what 320 or 330 million Americans think. I'm going to save myself 30 seconds here on the ASH experiments because you heard about them earlier, but I want to touch on some of the debriefing comments because they're important, the two of them that are here. Number one, the debriefing comments. When they asked afterwards, why did you give in to group pressure? People said two things. A, it's very unpleasant. I didn't like that feeling of going against the majority. And number two is, I knew what I said or what I picked was wrong. It was about inaccurate information, and I was fully well aware of that. And I still couldn't go against them. So think about climate change. We have almost two realities, or at least two realities, in this country of people believing in different realities of the science of climate change. How does that how do those different sets of facts get maintained? And this is part of the story. We have, since the 1970s, actually developed a number of different theoretical models and done research, and this is just taking one of those models, the spiral of silence, probably one of the more prominent models of how public opinion gets formed, both at the individual level and the macro level, meaning the societal level. And I'll walk you through it a little bit because it builds on those processes of the ASH experiment. And it says, look, we all express our opinions. We express them based on certain individual characteristics. Males, we know from research, are more likely to speak out in controversial situations than females. Young folks, more likely to speak out than older ones. Scales of fear of isolation. Am I worried about social ostracism? If yes, I'm less likely to speak out. But what's really interesting, the dynamic factors in this whole thing are two things. One is, what do I think everybody else thinks? Do I have a feeling of is this country or is my social environment in general in favor of GMOs? And as somebody who has 2 passports from this country and from Germany, I tell you when I visit my parents, I know exactly what the social environment is on GMOs. Well, what happens? Well, so let's assume I'm in favor of GMOs. I work at a College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. I have looked into the science behind it. I'm in favor. Yet I see all of a sudden that my social environment, let's assume I go to Germany, is incongruent with that. I notice that a majority is against it. So what I do is I'm more likely to fall silent, which of course then a lot of other people like me do it. And then in turn, that influences again the perceptions of public opinion. So you have the spiraling process where over time an opinion is established as the predominant one simply because the ones who are in the minority are much less likely to express their views. This has been tested in electoral context. We have tested this with ag biotech. Even in college settings, this ends up working. And to just also touch on, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because his name, Cialdini, came up twice today, and Katie mentioned this also as well, the social norms campaigns, exactly the same logic, taking the same mechanism, and you this morning probably saw this tag in your hotel room. Should you recycle or reuse rather your towels? What they did is over the course of 2 studies, they gave people 3 conditions in real hotels. They gave them one of those tags that said, look, be nice to the environment. Number 2 is be nice to the environment because 3 out of 4 other people do. Be nice to the environment because 3 out of 4 people in this very hotel room that you're staying at usually do this. And here's the numbers. Right? The numbers go up consistently. Why? Because the last one is essentially the Ash experiment recreated in your hotel room. All these people did it except for you didn't. So what's the problem with audiences, or why is it so complicated for audience to make sense of all of this? And one of the key concepts that I think in the area of science and politics that really has seen a renaissance is the field of motivated reasoning. I put one of the world is ending scenarios here just because I guess those people need to engage in motivated reasoning a lot because every time a deadline passes, they need to rearrange their realities. But basically, the idea is that all of us use motivated reasoning, if we like it or not. We process information based on the beliefs, the identities to some degree, but certainly the ideologies that we have. And we've seen in the science communication literature, we've seen that this concept is not new by any stretch, but we've seen a renaissance with cultural cognition. Many of you are aware of this. So the idea that our cultural values, our hierarchical versus collective values, shape how we take the exact same piece of information in different groups, process it differently. Some of our own research on perceptual filters showed how religiosity serves the exact same function for stem cell research, even for nanotechnology, where the same information is interpreted differently by more or less religious groups. Basically, the punchline for all of these things is the same information means different things to different people, period, based on ideologies, based on values. And all of us engage in that process to some degree. Just to give you one example, this is from Wisconsin, survey of state of Wisconsin on biofuels, asking about judgments, risks versus benefits. Do the risks outweigh the benefits, or benefits rather outweigh the risks economically? And then at the x-axis, you see how much they expose themselves to media content on the topic. And I can just tell you the Democrats and the Republicans here, what you see is for the low media diets, people who don't really expose themselves to all that much information, they're actually fairly close together. But the more they use this, and it's a fairly homogeneous set of information in newspapers and television in particular, the more you essentially see motivated reasoning, meaning they read the same stuff and then interpret it in different ways. There's selective exposure in this graph as well, but I can tell you if you put knowledge on the x-axis, it works exactly the same way. What are the reasons for it? A, of course, we've heard the directional goals, meaning we've heard about the idea that all of us are much more likely, if we firmly believe that something is true, we're much more likely to, if we get new information, to believe information that fits that goal, that fits that hypothesis that we have in our head. And we're much more likely to disconfirm, to counter-argue, and to question information that doesn't fit. And there's really not all that much we can do about that. I mean, there are things, but all of us do that to some degree. but they're also accuracy goals. And that's the second explanatory model for motivated reasoning, meaning we're more or less likely to engage with the information and try to really figure out what it means, rather than just take it at face value or whatever it may be. We know from research, for instance, that things like ambivalence about a topic actually makes you much more likely to engage in both sides of the argument. But we also know, and this is one of the things that ties this into the previous topic, meaning the public opinion pressure that I talked about, we know from Phil Tetlock's work and others that social accountability makes a huge difference. If I know that I will have to be in groups who will disagree with me and I will have to justify my opinions, I'm much more likely to carefully process information. So one of the things that we did, for instance, at Wisconsin, we put a bunch of undergrads in a lab, and we did a small experiment with them, and we told them that after the experiment, they would have to have discussions with others. Either with others that we left undefined, first column, that disagreed with them, that agreed with them, or they didn't have to have a discussion. And then we gave them a gated information environment, said spend 10 minutes looking at this information. And in that gated information environment, they had 3 equally distributed types of information, meaning they couldn't go outside. They could just browse these different websites and blogs. General news, science and medicine, and then editorial and opinion. And just to illustrate the point, obviously the analyses are more complex, but just to illustrate the point, if you think you're forced, because I never had to have these discussions, if you think you're forced to talk with other people that disagree with you, you're much more likely to start paying attention to argument on both sides of the issue, meaning going to the op-eds rather than to simply look at general news or science news. And if you actually look at what they really spend time with, drilling down to the pro and con, you see that confirmed. That also confirms a lot of research that we have in political science and political communication on why having a heterogeneous network, a network where you consistently exposed to not like-minded ideas, people who disagree with you in essence, are a good thing for you. National survey on political views now, where we analyzed where people live, even how diverse their neighborhoods were, how diverse their networks were. And let me just blow up one piece here so you can see it. Network heterogeneity means how diverse is your network in terms of opinions you're exposed to. And the effect is absolutely positive. It leads to more hard news newspaper use, more hard news TV use. At the time, in this survey, we didn't have internet measures. More factual political knowledge, and ultimately a more participatory public. So disagreement is good for us for a whole variety of reasons, and actually forces us to think through some of these things more carefully. Just a few thoughts in the time that I have remaining on where I think the next steps are. The big conundrum that we have in science is that separating the social context from the science is crucially important for the scientific endeavor. It's absolutely dysfunctional for science communication. Right? So the very value that makes science is dysfunctional for communicating it. If we like it or not, information and new science will be debated in the context in this very complex interplay between media environments, what they talk about and how they talk about it. The public opinion dynamics surrounding it, down to how much we think other people agree or disagree with us. And then, of course, our individual predispositions. And just the very last thought is a thought about certain competencies that I think we need for scientific citizens. And we've heard a number of speakers today, and again, I think also in the PNAS special issue from the last Sackler, emphasize the point that it's really not about knowledge or not just about knowledge. But really the competencies that we need is an ability to find scientific information, because it's not necessarily out there. And it's increasingly difficult to find it in a fragmented media environment that is either ideologically fragmented, and I put Rachel Maddow there, you can put Fox News there, or any other news show with smaller audience that are ideologically pure. Or this is what Nash mentioned earlier, the blog networks, right, that have created filter bubbles and echo chambers, meaning it's really easy to find what I already believe. It's really difficult to be exposed to things that I don't believe in. Second, the ability to connect that science to their daily lives, meaning the ability to, and this is in part for us, to find the language that makes that connection easy for audiences. The ability at a barbecue to explain something to your neighbor in a way that fits on the cognitive shelves that neighbor has, meaning that's of interest, that's of importance, and so on. And then the last one, and this is the important one, pursuing accuracy goals, meaning is there a way for us to to increase motivation among citizens to pursue accuracy goals, because they will engage in motivated reasoning, just like we all do. The question is, can we increase one of those motivations, and that is the accuracy goal? And it's not just about getting the right information to our citizens, but it's really help them get the information that they do get right. So the drawback, the one downside of it is there's really no easy answer to how to do all of these things. I think we're beginning to have empirical answers, but the beauty and the positive thing and the good news is all of the answers are empirical. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I generally find myself in agreement with what Dietram has to say about science communication, which is maybe why he invited me to be the discussant on his talk here. But I thought it'd be a bit boring to come all the way from England to comment on this, just to sort of embellish or supplement what he said. So I thought I'd go for something a bit more radical and propose a few ideas that are, I guess, an argument for a bit more humility. And I think it's not just this session, but for the whole narrative of this colloquium. So that's pretty grand ambition, I think. And what I want to argue is that rather than being a kind of cumulative scientific enterprise that gives practical guidance in difficult issues, science communication research is better characterized as being a kind of loose assemblage of interdisciplinary frameworks and approaches that's messy, that's difficult to interpret, largely non-cumulative. That's pretty pessimistic. I think it's certainly the case that sometimes it shows that our intuitive or anecdotal-based theories are probably wrong, not always, probably wrong, and the kind of the knowledge deficit perspective that we've heard referred to several times would be a good example of that. And this does really echo the last point that Dietram made, but it's not going to offer us any easy off-the-shelf solutions to the long-term problems of science communication. So, why is it that I'm constructing this kind of, somewhat pessimistic argument? Well, I think it's because the object of our study, the key object of our study, is a notoriously slippery, difficult thing to come to grips with. And here's a quote that I like. It brings me comfort late at night when I'm trying to work on data and so on, that it really is kind of like coming to grips with the Holy Ghost, even worse sometimes. And I mean, we'd need I think, a 3 or 4 day colloquium to run through what all the problems are, but I just want to mention some of my, I think some of the key things which highlight some of the problems that we face in researching public opinion about science and technology. One of them, it's pretty well known that small variations in how we ask the question, the wordings that we use, can have make a big difference to the distribution of answers that we get. Okay, and this is very well known, demonstrated in lots of different contexts, and it can often shift apparent public opinion from a minority to a majority position or vice versa. Now this is kind of worrying if what we think we're doing is measuring something real and concrete and making inferences and trying to figure out what to do. What's worse, I think, is that people have been shown to be willing to provide opinions to non-existent bills and legislation. In America, there have been people in favour of the Monetary Control Bill, the Agricultural Trade Act, and so on, which is good, but they don't actually exist. And this is, as much as it would be nice if it was just the Americans, we replicated this in Britain and found even people very strongly in favour of non-existent bits of legislation. And I think this is a problem throughout any area of politics, but particularly in science and technology, is the general lack of awareness. And that makes it very difficult to measure opinion, to understand opinion in areas. We conducted a survey last year in Britain where over half the population we found had never even heard the term human genome. It was very worrying to the funders of the work, the Wellcome Trust. So if we're interested in understanding public opinion, understanding how to, what the governance implications of new technologies are, these are real problems. But I think these are, in some senses, this still leaves a really valuable space for us to do descriptive work, and that's been referred to a number of times already, to understand where it's a valuable piece of information to know that the public are not aware of the human genome. But where things get even trickier are when we start trying to move into more explanatory mode, when we want to use some kind of causal inference. And I'm just going to give a brief example here, drawing on the motivated reasoning framework that Dietram described a moment ago. And I'll give a contrasting interpretation. And my argument is that we can't really determine between the two because our data essentially doesn't allow us to do so. Now, what we've got here is a chart from a paper I presented a couple of months ago, and we are looking at, this doesn't seem to work, this pointer, is it? You don't want to see the take-home yet. So what we're looking at is the relationship between knowledge of genetic science, which is along the x-axis, and people's attitude towards growing GM crops in Britain. It's been a pretty contentious issue, as you may know. And what you can see is that people's attitude is quite strongly related to their level of genetic knowledge. And we're just using a kind of standard factual knowledge quiz to measure knowledge. But you can see it varies a lot also by where you are on the left-right political dimension. So people on the left of politics are much more, there's a positive association, whereas people on the right, it's a negative association. Now, from a motivated reasoning perspective, we'd see this as people on the left and right interpreting the same factual information differently. Okay, this would be a bias in our reasoning. But we can also interpret this as what's called an enlightened preference, that people, as your level of knowledge increases, you're better able to connect your core values to the policy preferences that best suit them. I mean, after all, we wouldn't really expect people on the left and the right of politics to have the same policy views, would we? But the bigger point that I want to make here is that we are limited in being able to make these kind of causal inferences because we're usually using either observational data, which limits our causal inference, or experimental data, which has problems with external validity. So I realise this message, brief as it is, goes rather against the grain of this colloquium. So let me be clear. I think there's a huge amount of benefit. I think this is a really excellent meeting, and there's a lot to be gained from STEM researchers engaging more in this the field of science communication. But to echo what Dietram said, there will be no easy answers to the long-standing problems. And in particular, this is, I guess, my plea is that we need to, as social scientists, we need to avoid over-promising what the field can deliver. And we also need to avoid the implicit promise that we can offer up some kind of communication science that will enable scientists to get the public on side for the latest favoured technology. That would be, I think, a really regressive step. And I'm just going to finish with a quote to show that it's not just because we're stupid or lazy, this really is a difficult area. Thank you.
I'm going to pretend I'm a second negative in a debate team. And I'm going to take on what is a scattershot approach and then try to say something coherent. The notion that the candidates didn't address things relevant to climate change in Dietram's presentation presupposes that what they talked about to the mass audience and we overheard it. There was, in fact, a fairly detailed discussion of things relevant to climate change, but it was micro-targeted to people who are probably not in this audience. And that micro-targeting used the agenda-setting capacity of repetition through multiple channels, including social media channels, but also micro-targeting through radio and cable, in order to have a discussion about, quote-unquote, the Obama war on coal if you were Mitt Romney. Increasingly, if we use a mass media perspective to try to understand how the public is coming to understand some of this, we will miss part of what part of the public is actually being exposed to. And that war on coal rhetoric is an extraordinarily powerful rhetoric if it is targeted to you in a coal state in which you perceive that your employment is tied to the well-being of a coal economy. And as a result, agenda setting, framing, and priming are going to work differently on you because the resonance of topic tied to that redundancy is going to play through in ways that will make you a powerful communicator on the issue if that communication channel lays in place lines of argument that are coherent and strands of evidence that reinforce it. And those will then appear inside channels of communication that we are able to see, and we will be completely bewildered about how they got there. That's my first point. Micro-targeting is changing the way in which communication functions. It's not changing the way in which we process it cognitively. It's changing the ways in which we get it. And it means increasingly that we don't have the kind of exchanges across ideology or across perspectives or across knowledge networks that make it possible for, and here's my positive point, debates to function as well as they actually function in the United States. There's a reliable finding in presidential debates, which is that people learn from them. Now, how do people learn from presidential debates? Well, first, it's two-sided. Secondly, it's mass exposure. Third, we all collectively watch in larger numbers than we watch anything else in politics. Doesn't rival Super Bowl, but large numbers. And as a result, we create a climate in which there's going to be discussion after the debate, and there's going to be some of that discussion that will at least intersect non-like-minded networks. And out of that, you have the possibility that you're at least going to hear the other side and come to understand it, even if you are not persuaded by it. And as a result, the likelihood that you're going to get learning occurring, even among those who have paid high levels of attention to media, goes up. The reason you get learning among those who haven't paid high attention is because the debates actually do cover things that media don't cover in a two-sided fashion in which there's exchange. You might have gotten one side, but you're not going to necessarily get the other. Increasingly in a micro-targeted world, you're not going to get the other. Well, here's the larger question, and this is point two. How do we create more of these large mass exposure experiences in which we get exchanges about the things that matter to public policy when these candidates on climate change, for example, saw no self-interest in raising it, and the moderators in the debates didn't either? And the answer is, our target is the moderator in the debate who needs to frame the issue, because then you're going to get the exchange. Whether you're going to get learning as a result is a function of how much other stuff there's out there that's already anchoring attitudes and is also bringing all these other schematic structures to bear. But there's a failure in our debate structure which does reliably produce learning when the moderator doesn't ever ask the question. And that's a real problem in the debates of 2012. And that's my second point. Third, we know some things about how framing operates. And Dietram did a nice job in quickly telegraphing them. Let me tell you about how framing doesn't operate. Framing doesn't operate very powerfully when there's counter-framing in the environment. The new media environment is giving us increasing amounts of counter-framing. Framing works best when your structure and the structure being offered to you coincide enough that they overlap and you get reinforcement, and nothing is out there saying this is the alternative. But now, in a partisan media environment in which you have high levels of micro-targeted content, the likelihood that you're going to have counter-framing on just about everything is much, much higher. And that means the power of framing goes down. Much of what we know about framing is drawn from laboratory experiments. Well, it works really well in laboratory experiments, primarily because there's no counter-framing in most of those experiments. And that's my third point. My fourth point is that Dietram started with Galileo. And I'd like to go back to something that Susan mentioned this morning. We have this strange finding, which is you've got the minority resistors, and we tend to trust those people because, and I believe her explanation was, they really seem to believe what they believe and they're really tenacious. Did I get that right? I have another explanation, compatible. We're using the Galileo heuristic. We are saying sometimes they are right, and maybe they're Galileo. And maybe the fact that they're arguing as aggressively as they are and persistently as they are means that we should take them seriously. And that's what I took this first slide to actually be telling me. It was explaining those minority resistors. Fourth, I'd like to put up a headline for you, and I'd ask you to rewrite it. And this is my clue to punch the button. This is New York Times this Saturday. Here's the headline. You spent an entire day studying science communication. Are you happy with the headline? I'll tell you something important about media framing. It's the headline that frames. The headline is now framing to say, but long-term decline may continue. How many of you believe that an asteroid may destroy the National Academy of Sciences in the last month? It may destroy. Raise your hand, please. An asteroid may destroy. Just raise your hand. Scientists, please. How many of you may destroy? How many of you think likely to destroy? Raise your hand. Now, if you want to say, I care about framing, you actually don't care about the rest of that article. You care about that headline. The rest of the article, I brought it with me, but I knew you all would have read it. It's a great article. It has great quotes from scientists. It concludes with this paragraph. Lately, a new low in summer sea ice has been set every few years, followed by a few years of recovery, followed by yet another few that typically exceed the previous one by a substantial margin. Does that headline capture that statement? Then the New York Times, thank you New York Times, breaks out this statement. Second statement, sea coverage is 50% greater than it was after last year's. Well, yes, it actually was. That is factually accurate. And what is it missing? Trend across time. If we don't educate science reporters to cover what matters, and we don't educate headline writers to frame the science articles correctly, we don't really have to worry about educating scientists to be good communicators because their messages will never pass effectively through media in order to reach audiences.
Thank all three of you. Dietram, do you have some immediate comments?
Well, I thought I had struck a fairly pessimistic tone until until my discussants came up. So two things. I do think Patrick's last points, I mean all of them, but in particular I think the last 2 points are extremely well taken. And I think there's a certain irony, and I'd never heard it phrased that way in terms of social science overpromising. We've often talked about stem cell overpromising and that becoming a communication problem. But science communication overpromising and that becoming a communication problem, I do think it's a fair point and a well-phrased point. And then I also think Kathleen's points 1 and 2, well, again, all of them, but highlighting points 1 and 2, the idea of micro-targeting is going to complicate things beyond imagination, especially for folks who are not directly involved in political campaigns. And Obama, of course, being the first president who ended up hiring statisticians to do the micro-targeting for him and really determining exactly how much money to ask for, not just making a $20 ask, but actually using regressions and micro-targeting to figure out exactly what to ask for. And that, of course, being in many ways directly at odds with the second point, and that is we need mass experiences where we get that heterogeneity, right? We're moving toward a world where it's easier and easier and easier, both based on our own selectivity, to just be exposed to information that we like, but also based on what media do to us, meaning that the holy grail, of course, in many ways, is to find out what exactly I read on my tablet, how long I've spent reading it, which pictures I've clicked on, and then tailoring news toward me. There is no point for any news organization to give me on my Android tablet anything about baseball. I will never look at it. I don't care about baseball, don't understand it. You have to grow up with that sport, right? I haven't. So there is no commercial reason for any media outlet knowing what I do on a daily basis, what I read on my Kindle, on my Android, to give me that anymore. Yet those very experiences, meaning me being exposed to the other side and the debates being among them, is exactly what the research that I showed, and your argument exactly being the same, is what we need. So we're in that real paradoxical situation where we're getting better at micro-targeting, and that's worse and worse for us democratically. And I think that's one of the big challenges.
Would either of you like to dig us any deeper? Now we'll take a question from the audience. Is there one back? Okay, yeah. And then we have somebody down here. So.
I'm just wondering if Twitter isn't an opportunity for scientists' revenge, if you like, to do their own framing. Traditional media doesn't usually give you the right to reply, ergo we end up with nonsense, both framing headlines and articles. So I guess I put it to you, is Twitter the way to get around that?
I mean, I'm a big believer, and as I indicated this earlier a little bit when at the previous panel, I'm a big believer in the extremely positive role that social media and online media in general can play in giving scientists a voice that they didn't have beforehand, and also the ability to present issues in a way that they're excited about. I mean, we all do this work because we're excited about something, right? It's coming from Wisconsin, it's what I would call the beer and bratwurst test, right? If over a beer and a bratwurst you can explain why this is exciting to anybody around you, you have a good communication message. And in many ways, social media allow you to do that, absolutely. But social media, and this also goes back to the previous panel, only have an effect if you end up getting the multipliers in the long run. I mean, you can build followers, but unless you're I don't know the people, if Lady Gaga is still up there as one of the people with the most followers, but she's definitely up there among the top 5 somewhere. Unless you hit these kinds of people, you just don't get the multiplier effect. And I think it's, again, the assumption that we're the only ones communicating is a little bit implicit in that, right? That if I tweet, then there will be a public reaction. Well, the types of communication that we as scientists, that we as social scientists, that associations engage in are all part of a larger landscape. And I think a large part of this panel is to figure out what that landscape looks like and how to operate within that landscape, both politically and otherwise. So I think I'm very optimistic that yes, there's room for that. But I don't think it's, again, that easy solution that we're looking for. I think it's a small mosaic piece in a whole larger approach.
One of the things that excites me about Twitter is the linking and the alerting functions potentially can be used to motivate individuals to gain deeper knowledge structures to bring into discussions with others who are not inside their Twitterverse. And I think understanding how we use the limited characters to get the linking alerting function to drive people to things that will deepen their knowledge base and their capacity to argue and counter-argue is an area that is very rich as a scholarly area of pursuit.
I'm pessimistic. I'm pessimistic about Twitter's ability to better connect scientists to parts of the public that are not usually reached. I don't think it will, precisely because people are selecting into it, and what we know about reception of information that you're not interested in, if you happen to come by, it's going to put you off. You'll stop, you'll unfollow in the terminology, I guess. I think it offers extraordinary potential for communication between scientists and in the sort of hinterland of journalism and so on. So it has some side benefits, but I very strongly doubt that it will open up a new channel of more unmediated communication between scientists and lay publics.
First, thank you. It's really an amazing conference. I mainly came in the hopes of communicating my interests in niche area more effectively, and although I believe in evolution and climate change, less so about that, but I don't know whether it's the right term. Isn't the 800-pound gorilla in the room the massive disinformation process? It's not just that we're not communicating, it's that there's an active process of disinformation spreading, and what are our options for overcoming that?
And so, I mean, this is in many ways exactly the point I was trying to address with some of the last thoughts on the topic of motivated reasoning, right? So some of the processes engaged in motivated reasoning, and again, I don't mean motivated reasoning as a bias, I mean motivated reasoning as something that we all engage in. And the idea that the solution is not to counter Jenny McCarthy with more pro-vaccination information. The idea is can we figure out ways to create citizen competencies that have nothing to do with a lecture hall type model where I'm teaching them just yet another time about vaccinations and why the facts that Jenny McCarthy facts liberally used, may be using to support her case are wrong. The competency that we need is the motivation for citizens to engage in some of these accuracy motivations that come with it, meaning what makes them more likely. And part of it is social. Part of it is being in social accountability situations, in networks that are heterogeneous, that are not filter bubbles, where I'm not, when I get a piece of news that doesn't come from my homogeneous Facebook feed or whatever else. So are there types of literacy that we should be building rather than producing more knowledge feeds that hopefully give more information to counter more misinformation? So the idea is that citizens will actually be able to sift through that and have the, not just be able, but be willing, because a large part of is a cognitive investment. If I have to sit there and I'm wondering about childcare, and I'm wondering about getting to work today, and I'm wondering about what I'm going to cook for dinner tonight, synthetic biology is not extremely high on that list at that very moment. So the question is, why am I engaging in that? Or if somebody gives me a fairly easy interpretation for why I shouldn't vaccinate my children, and the counter argument as well, because here's a whole host of facts. The question is, how can we increase those motivations? And do we need to think about a whole new set of competencies rather than simply pushing out more and more and more knowledge? And I would very strongly argue for the latter, because we all will use it. The question is just to which degree are we going to engage actively and actually are going to be able to make informed or at least enlightened choices, to use Patrick's words, about scientific issues that, if we're honest, we'll ultimately never fully understand. Unless I'm a nanoscientist, I will never read the primary literature. Unless I'm a medical doctor of some sort, I will most likely not read the primary literature, even on vaccinations. And all the people who are against it most likely haven't read it either, and all the people who are in favor of it, if we admit it, haven't read that literature either. So ultimately the question is, how do I make enlightened choices without necessarily more information? And I think that's ultimately the trigger that we really need to worry about. And I think that's also the most successful one, if we are being successful.
We've actually seen a really important change in my very long lifetime in the way in which reporters have treated a category of data. Polls used to be reported very uncritically. Now, when polls are reported, you can expect, with any reputable journalistic outlet, you're going to see a margin of error, you're going to see response rates, you're going to see number of respondents, and you're going to see the questions disclosable in some form that you can evaluate to see whether or not there was a framing effect. One of the answers to this question is that we need to find ways to ensure that those who are, in essence, custodians of the transfer process of some forms of knowledge have very high standards about what they will traffic forward and what they will not. And if you divide your world right now into partisan media and ask, do those things that you think of as partisan media apply these polling criteria? They do. There's the possibility, in other words, that at least some domains, the integrity underlying the enterprise can be protected by education of the journalistic community. And that was largely in effect in polling produced by APOR.
And that's actually a really good example, too, because if you ask people to explain margin of error to you, they actually can't. A majority of Americans actually doesn't know what it is, but they do understand that they need to know the information in order, because experts have conveyed to them that that's an important piece of information.
And good reporters are saying that means this finding is in this range, as opposed to, as it's in the margin of error, we don't trust that this is the finding. It's outside the margin of error, you can trust it, which is actually all the public needs to know if the journalist has done his or her job.
As a slightly tangential point, I'd also, I mean, there's a premise perhaps in your, maybe misinterpreting, you're saying that there's more misinformation, more disinformation these days, and I just wonder whether that premise, any PhD candidates out there, there's a good topic for a thesis, but we do have a tendency to think that things are getting worse, right? And I'm not, this doesn't go against the points that you've made. There is misinformation, disinformation, but there is a question about whether that is a phenomenon which is getting worse these days.
There is more in politics. If you're tracking political advertising across time, there is more now because there's more total advertising. So, the denominator is increasing. If the numerator stays the same, the logic.
Please.
So you had mentioned a headline as a very powerful framing device. Can graphics and imagery serve that function as well?
Yes. And when they're consistent with each other and consistently deceptive, that's even more problematic. But when they're consistent with each other and not, you get the verbal-visual redundancy effect, which can also create some schematic coherence because if the visual is well created and the frame is tightly positioned. and they're mutually reinforcing, you now actually have developed a structure for understanding. Really good journalism does that.
There's actually a great example that I show in my class when Rachel Corrie, I'm not sure how many of you remember that, there's an American who got run over in the Gaza Strip by an Israeli tank and protested against Israeli occupation. And AP and Reuters released news releases at almost the exact same time, had almost the exact same content verbally, but they had two different pictures. And I can't remember if it was Reuters or AP which one had which, but one of them has a picture of her in an orange jumpsuit with her friends around it, bleeding from her nose, essentially bleeding to death. And that ran with the story. The other visual for the other story had her burning an American flag from an archival photo in the Gaza Strip, surrounded by Palestinian children screaming and yelling anti-American slogans. So simply offering the two different images on the exact same story. Now, what is your interpretation? For one story, were the Israelis at fault? Did she die in an accident, or did she die in something that she really caused herself? And simply changing the visual, completely changing the interpretation of the story. So one really good example of that.
Okay, please.
Hi, Marty Downs from Brown University. I want to swing back to the micro-targeting conversation a little bit. To what extent do micro-targeted messages need to be consistent across audiences and consistent with a broader message? And what's the cost that people pay when they aren't?
We ran in 2008 the largest academic survey that was done of the electorate. We ran 100,000 interviews overall. We had half of that in a 5-wave panel, half of that a rolling cross-sectional survey, so we were able to track day-to-day variability. And we were able to look at the Obama micro-targeting strategy. And an effective micro-targeting strategy doesn't, at the mass level, ever take the micro-targeted message up in any way that you would be able to tag it as inconsistent. And as a result, when the Obama campaign in 2008 in radio and micro-targeted cable argued that McCain opposed stem cell research, when instead McCain had stood up against the president of his own party in order to support stem cell research, you couldn't, as you moved up the channel of communication to get the broader messages, find any trace of it at all. I run factcheck.org. One of our challenges is finding those micro-targeted messages to put them into the mass media channel to say to people, don't you want to hold him accountable for that, and to get accuracy so those who are micro-targeted get the facts. In this case, facts that disadvantaged McCain among independent women who were the target of the micro-targeting. And we showed the effects of that in the survey in the rolling cross-section.
I just want to express a little more concern about the misinformation, because we see a very pointed effort by a number of billionaires or gazillionaires to buy newspapers. We already know the effect of the political contributions in Congress, basically hog-tying that, their ability to move forward. I just see big money for the first time in my life. I'm really actually pretty concerned about it, making it virtually impossible to push beyond some very narrow corporate interests here. So I'm just curious if any of you perceive that as well.
I'll start and then you can. So I think there's two things to this. One is that I think we need to, and maybe that echoes what Kathleen said earlier, but the idea of mass is over, right? The idea of mass media. And that's certainly, even newspapers that still exist will not exist with a consistent set of front pages and so on and so forth. There's no, as I said earlier, there's no reason why any of us would not get tailored front pages of the New York Times before long. And in many ways, they're already geographically targeted. It's just a function of targeting them more and more and more. So the idea that we have mass media that even if what's his name, Bezos ends up buying the Washington Post and so on and so forth, I think the idea of mass media in that sense is really on the decline, and of reaching audiences in that mass medium where all of us tune into the evening news where 3 older white guys end up reading news to us. That's over. And actually Rachel Maddow, who I had up there earlier, gave a very interesting lecture on that at some point, where she was talking about that new idea, that more polarized news environment, And one of the questions she was asking the audience is, what is better? You know, is it better to have me as a young, openly lesbian woman having my TV show, or do we really want to have three old guys, white guys, essentially reading the news to all of us in a very homogenized fashion? And there's more complexity to her argument than I'm representing here, but I think there's a point to that. More importantly, I think the second level, though, and that is at the individual level, we have a bigger information environment, more diverse than we've ever had. If I want to read anything on the Al Jazeera website or on The Guardian, or want to get it from Fox News, or want to get it from some extreme website, I can get it right now at this very moment. I can just have to pick up my mobile and I will get it in here. So it's not a problem that we don't have access to this information. It's not a problem that it's not available. And it doesn't matter if the Koch brothers, whoever else, put 500 million new websites up. We can still avoid all of them if we wanted to. The problem is a different one, and the problem is that ultimately we choose not to, and we don't have the motivation to seek it out. And of course, there's, again, other complexities with micro-targeting in there, but I think we're always leaving out that second part as if we still have that mass audience where I can't get news anywhere else but the network stations, and that's just has not been the case for a long time. The problem is not that the information commonwealth hasn't arrived. With all the information that's possible out there, scientifically, I can get most of the papers even if I just do the right search. They're available online. The problem is how we're interpreting that and how we end up cleaning up our news diets in filter bubbles and in echo chambers. And again, your Facebook feed is probably a fairly good indicator. If during the election you had equal numbers of friends who rooted for both candidates, you're the exception. What most likely happened is that if you're a Democrat, you got a whole bunch of messages that were pro-Obama and very few that were pro-Mitt Romney because your friends just reinforced your own viewpoints on Facebook. And if you're honest, that's exactly what happened. And if not, then you're one of the few people who are in those heterogeneous networks.
I wouldn't say the mass media era is over yet. We're in transition.
I agree.
Much of what we're picking up in terms of internet use is actually coming through a mass media channel of some sort. But we're making a transition that is pretty dramatic. The best way I can answer your question about money in politics is to say that in 2008, we married a complete data set of radio, television, and cable ad buys, which means that we were not able to pick up the internet stream at that point. Less important than it would have been had we missed that in 2012. 57,000 interviews in a rolling cross-sectional model with battleground, non-battleground split. And we were able to show how 100 gross ratings points differential in spending affected attitudes toward candidates. Obama substantially outspent McCain. That helped him win. He would have won otherwise, but it would have been a much, much closer election had he not had a clear spending advantage and a far more competent campaign team.
Please.
So I've heard a lot of discussion today about strategies and approaches for different constituencies, but I haven't heard a lot about approaches to reach an undergraduate student population as one of those constituencies. That's certainly a population that has a high degree of plasticity, perhaps an open mind, and they certainly are comfortable with social media. So my question is, what competencies can you tell us would be most effective in helping those learners acquire science literacy, foundational science literacy? How would you go about doing that?
You're talking about undergrad populations now? Yeah. And I think undergrad populations in many ways are a really good example where it's in part about their competencies, but in part also about the competencies of the person who's communicating with them. And I think this is where the framing example is a really good one, because in many ways, you know, the response to the idea of framing and of the importance of thinking about the mode of presentation is very often from scientists, well, we don't want to spin our science, right? We want to engage in something that maybe Frank Lentz has done for the Republicans for a long time. But my response to that would be a bit more differentiated, and that is, you don't teach, I hope, that you don't teach your doctoral seminar on research methods, say quantitative social science research methods, the same way you teach your 120 sophomore students intro class. Because if you do, your teaching evaluations are going to be 1.2 out of 5. So what does that mean? That means, are you going to dumb down the science for them? No. Are you going to simplify things? Well, maybe, but certainly you're presenting that in a way that's accessible to somebody who is in a required research methods course, meaning they don't want to be there, actually very similar to our science general science public, right? 13% of the American public say they pay very close attention to science, so really they don't want to be there. They ultimately don't necessarily have the framework mathematically or statistically yet they do need to learn it. And so finding ways of connecting with them, finding examples, finding metaphors, I think is crucially important. So that's really about, I think, competencies not at the side that you're asking. But the second one is actually not that different, meaning what are the competencies among the students? Where is, and this goes back to accuracy motivations, which I really have, don't want to overemphasize, but the idea that I'm not giving them the right information, I'm trying to figure them out, help them figure out what the right information is, and sort through the different information and make sense of it. And I think that, I mean, we would, every person who's ever applied to any department that I was ever in, when we asked for a teaching statement, said, well, critical thinking skills, right? And we've read this all 1,000 times. But ultimately, that's what it comes down to. It comes down to the accuracy motivation that is just very often not there. And I think that's one of the key competencies, in my opinion.
I don't really have anything to add to that, but I wouldn't mind answering the question from the Twitter feed.
Okay.
If I can choose which one to answer.
You have a preference?
Well, I quite like the first one.
Okay, go for it.
Well, if you go down and read it, that's do social media such as Twitter afford a new and potentially important way to gauge public opinion? I guess we might say about science and technology. I think my answer to that would be yes and no. I think yes, because it gives us an opportunity to understand how people behave in that very important environment. It also enables us to understand the evolution of public opinion and often the kind of the key movers and shakers in that sense. Where I'm pessimistic again is that, and I'm someone who's a kind of a survey researcher, so I would say this. I mean, I think that there's something really important about giving the entire public a voice on matters that are consequential for public policy, for science governance and so on. And so polls can overcome some of the biases that we're concerned about misinformation and media ownership and so on. So I think it's really crucial that we, alongside new techniques that we need to develop to analyse social media, we need to retain this ability to make inferences about the whole population, or dare I say it, the public.
Could I just add something to that, because and an extension, and I think that's very much true, and I fully agree with everything that Patrick has said. We've started doing work with folks out at Cambridge in a company called Crimson Hexagon, and there's many suppliers like it, but essentially doing sentiment analysis of what's going on social media. And there's a certain beauty to that, right? Because what you do is you have computational linguistic learning, machine learning, and you have human coding. So you can actually take and code, let's say, tweets or code Facebook messages if they're public or whatever else, and code them for certainty and uncertainty. You do human coding. You do valid human coding. And eventually the algorithms will understand what linguistic patterns, word patterns, co-occurrences, and so on represent uncertainty, represent certainty on Twitter, in other media, and obviously the algorithms are different. And then that allows you to actually monitor sentiment, either regionally, kind of where the tweets originate, who the opinion leaders are, coming back to some of the stuff that we talked about earlier, who the influentials are, who the influencers of the influencers are, and so on. But all of that with a disclaimer of what Patrick just said, and that is, they're not proxies for public opinion. And my numbers, I'm sure, are off. Deb can correct me, but the last numbers were 200+ million users for Twitter worldwide. And that doesn't even cover the US public, and certainly it has a unique demographic characteristics. But it is very useful for an upstream kind of assessment of what are the emerging themes, what are the types of technology, let's say for nano, which is really very much an enabling technologies, what are the types of applications maybe that trigger traffic, and what are kind of some of the issues that are coming up. And so I think as an upstream mode of monitoring and of figuring out and maybe finding ways of starting conversations and engagement, I think they're very useful. As an assessment for public opinion, I'm fully with you. They're not there yet, and they may never be there, I think.
One of the problems with doing public opinion research is that we've conventionalized a forced choice model to ask people things, and we don't give them a strong option to say don't know. So when Dietram reports a high % of don't knows, I'm guessing he gave them the option to say don't know, as opposed to they had to say, wait a minute, I don't know, to force themselves onto the answer sheet. And I worry sometimes that we think we have informed public opinion when we have forced choice, top of the head, unformed public opinion. I wish we could develop an ethic inside the survey research system in which we spent time asking what it is they actually do know, how they think they actually know it, so that we could figure out what it is we need to put in place in order to help them come into these discussions. We've always tracked a knowledge battery into our surveys of the electorate. It makes our surveys unique. And what we find across time is there is an increase in the amount of accurate knowledge in political campaigns, in large part because of exposure to debates, over and above exposure to the various news outlets. With those knowledge questions, you're able to say, when do they start getting it more wrong as opposed to more right in a campaign? And almost inevitably, it's because the politician has a self-interest in confusing them about something, and the rhetoric is driving down accurate knowledge in order to get elected. Well, if we had our polls set up so that we spent more time asking what it is they know, what it is they understand, maybe we would know better as a community worrying about very complex issues what it is they need to know in order to understand enough to enter this debate in an intelligent fashion, or at least to be governed about it in some way when the choice is made so that they can say they acquiesced to it.
Let me thank the audience and the panel for, thank you. You can go, yes. Didn't want to say dismissed, but well, let me thank everybody for all of your contributions. According to your program, I'm going to tell you what it's all about. And so, if we've learned anything today, it's that it will mean different things to different people, and legitimately so, because people bring different knowledge. That's why we're so grateful to have all of you here. People are solving different problems. We hope to be providing something to everybody. So under those circumstances, I'm going to take an avowedly egocentric stance and tell you what it meant to me. And if you feel like you've heard this before, then I hope I will get the trust that, according to Susan, sometimes accrues to persistent minorities of one. So 4 points. So one is that I take away that we can do better at understanding other people. Each of the scientists who have come here, we have our own narrow perspective, and I think each of us have learned something from other people. I think that people are often despair of communication, whether it's in these arenas or interpersonal arenas, because they've just run out of ideas for how to figure out what is motivating other people. And the social sciences give us tools to learn something about individual interactions, and they also give us results that may be generally true. So don't despair. There are more things to do, and by recognizing that there are the tools, we avoid the despair that comes with thinking that public opinion is refractory to any sort of external criticism. Maybe our analysis has just failed. And as Susan said, people are not idiots. It's up to us to try to figure out what's happening with them. And in the course of that process, we'll get, as Doug and others showed us, we'll have better self-reflection on ourselves, because we'll see things that other people were attuned to and that we might have been deaf to. Second, that we can do better in terms of our communication. So as you've heard in the last panel, there are no magic bullets. There are no simple solution. But there is a much larger toolkit that we can draw on, both to avoid things known not to work, and then to come up with things that have a better chance of working, and then to monitor our success in order to see how we're going. There's a substitute for campaigns or programs, or somebody's got a great idea, sells it to somebody else who's willing to fund it, gives money to somebody else who gives it great production values, and either it worked or it didn't work. The real test of the campaign is whether the person who gave the production values can sell themselves, their wares, to the person who's got the money to write the campaign. We can take the same resources, even with the same people, and do better by using a collection of the principles that we have that we have here, because none of the social sciences would pretend that they have the answer for how to do everything. It's quite contextualized. Third, we can't tell how well we've realized this promise of understanding others and understanding ourselves better and improving those two-way communications until we try and then monitor our success, and trying to mobilize that effort is part of the purpose of these colloquia. However, for us to do that, it's going to require changes in our social and intellectual organizations. We're going to need post-disciplinary teams where people work together and find ways to integrate one another's work. We're going to need to have the kind of modesty about individual work needed in order to have these integrative programs. We're going to need to avoid any pretense of overselling. We're going to need to acknowledge our problems. We're going to need supportive institutions that will reward scientists at all stages in their career who are willing to engage in the discipline and the time commitment needed in order to communicate. We're going to need to work as citizens to create the kind of new forms of social interaction that the last two panels were, last two panels were talking about. We may need not only new forms of research that bring our disciplines together, but as Kathleen has suggested, perhaps a new research ethic of not doing things that will be insufficiently informative and may mislead us. And in all, we're going to need the kind of community that's, for all this, need the kind of community that's collected here and has joined us electronically. So let me thank you all. We will start tomorrow at 8:30. You will get to hear Kathleen speak at length on, I'll make certain I get the wonderful topic right, responding to the attack on the best available evidence. So see you then.